I'm delighted to be here speaking at this online conference on geoengineering, a very important topic which is assuming more and more importance as it attracts more attention. I'll leave it to Lily, of course, to speak in more detail about the techniques in question, but I would begin by just noting that geoengineering in the form of carbon capture and storage is already locked in to plans around the world to meet the climate problem. Net zero actually means emissions reductions plus carbon capture and storage. The IPCC's scenarios all have carbon capture and storage entrenched within them. The International Energy Agency foresees this technology, and indeed the European Green Deal assumes that carbon capture and storage will play a substantial role. But let me focus more on solar geoengineering, because the pressure to take it seriously is gathering pace. China has a research program. In the United States, a report from the US National Academies called for a $100 million research program. And the White House Office of Science and Technology is coordinating a 5-year research plan to study solar geoengineering. Well, the technology for spraying sulfate aerosols, the foremost solar geoengineering scheme, the technology for spraying sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere is quite straightforward and relatively cheap. In fact, venture capitalists with questionable motives are already offering cooling credits for sale on the market after carrying out some quite dodgy experiments with a high altitude balloon. But even for those of us who are most skeptical, in fact, anxious about the prospect of solar geoengineering, in a couple of decades, we may well be faced with an excruciating moral dilemma. Imagine it's 2040 and the Earth is reeling under an extreme warming surge. Crops have failed and there are famines in Africa and across the Indian subcontinent. Climate scientists are warning that the Earth system is perilously close to crossing certain climatic tipping points, such as the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which has in fact already begun, and that these tipping points are likely to bring a cascade of tipping events, which would send the Earth onto a warming trajectory from which there is no going back. This is a very realistic scenario, of course. Now, the temptation in those circumstances to send up the planes into the stratosphere with sulfate aerosols to spray into the atmosphere would be very intense because the evidence suggests that such a program of sulfate aerosol spraying could in fact cool the Earth quite quickly, perhaps by a degree in 12 months. Others, of course, are worried about the dangerous and unforeseen side effects. And there was a very interesting study just a month or two ago, which inadvertently pointed to some potentially very serious consequences of one kind of solar geoengineering, and that is the one known as marine cloud brightening. So let me take a little bit of a detour to illustrate this issue and also the extraordinary complexity and interconnectedness of the Earth system. So in October 2019, actually at 10:55 a.m., a lightning bolt hit a tree in a national park about 100 kilometres northwest of Sydney. And fanned by hot winds in a forest, that was dried out, parched by climate change, a bushfire broke out and it quickly took off. And after several days, the bushfire gained a tremendous ferocity that turned it into a monster fire. In fact, what became known as Australia's first mega blaze when it joined up with 5 other bushfires or wildfires that had broken out elsewhere. And it was a fire of such scorching intensity that the superheated air above it generated its own weather system, and it would over the next weeks burn through 1 million hectares, about the size of Belgium. Now, the effects of that bushfire were felt around the world. A study published last month looked at the impact of the massive quantities of smoke that were released by these so-called black summer fires in Australia, the effect on the global weather. Smoke particles were blown eastward across a large area, eventually of the southeastern Pacific, off the coast of South America. And these smoke particles interacted with clouds to make them thicker and whiter, so that they reflected more sunlight back into space. And these thicker, brighter clouds cooled the ocean beneath in the southeastern Pacific. So you can see this is very similar to some proposals for marine cloud brightening. However, the cooler Pacific waters are believed to have shifted northward the cloud and rain belt known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And this in turn intensified for 3 years the La Nina events that have just passed, causing cooler, damper conditions in Australia. But also this intensified La Nina, well, of 3 events over 3 years, were responsible, according to this study, for drought, crop failures, and hunger in Eastern Africa. So let's think about that. A lightning strike in a severely dried out forest northwest of Sydney may have been the cause for more drought and hunger in Eastern Africa, which is 12,000 kilometres to Sydney's west, and it did so via its effect on the ocean temperature in the southeastern Pacific, 8,000 or 9,000 kilometres to Sydney's east. So it's a very salutary message, a very sobering message about geoengineering in a complex Earth system. So returning to our hypothetical, which is not so hypothetical, of what might happen in 2040, where the pressure is enormous due to a massive heat event, tipping points being crossed, famines, thousands of people dying from heat waves and various other impacts of a huge warming at that time. So there are some who want to engineer the climate. They want to send up the planes to spray sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere and quickly cool the planet in order to try to reduce the catastrophic effects of warming. The question I want to pose is, who do we trust to have their hands on the planet's thermostat? Who is going to be sending up the planes, making decisions about how many to send, how much sulfates to spray into the atmosphere, where to do it, how long to do it, what kind of particles should be used? Who is going to be doing this? Is it the United States? Will it be China? Would India decide that it has no option but to mobilise its air force suitably, with its planes suitably modified to spray sulfate aerosols? Or would it be a private entrepreneur, Elon Musk, for example, with a a saviour complex. I mean, Elon Musk could do it now. There's actually no international law stopping him from doing so. So it's this problem of global governance that's causing most anxiety amongst critics of solar geoengineering. If someone is going to regulate the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, who is it going to be? And whose interests will they be looking after? What if India decided it had to act out of desperation, but in doing so, brought about a famine in Pakistan because it shifted the monsoon? Or even if there was a suspicion that spread amongst the Pakistani people that the famine or the intensification of the famine was caused by India's actions in trying to regulate the weather. You can see that it leads to extraordinary geopolitical and moral problems. And that's why some experts and governments of the global south say that we should not even carry out research into solar geoengineering until we have in place a governance mechanism that is fair and inclusive. And indeed, a statement has been signed by hundreds of scientists and governance scholars around the world calling for an international non-use agreement, arguing that the technology of solar geoengineering is actually ungovernable. We will never find a fair, inclusive, and democratic way to govern solar geoengineering. I mean, after all, we've seen what's happening now with artificial intelligence. It's now out of control because no one put in a regulatory system in place before it took off. And now even the AI experts involved in building the AI systems are so worried about the potential that for AI getting out of control that they are calling for regulation of themselves. They want governments to regulate themselves because they're so worried about the implications of what they're doing. So solar geoengineering is a grand Promethean project that's almost beyond comprehension in its implications. What we might find for those of us environmentalists who've been arguing for years that our technology and our Promethean ambitions have got out of control and we must step back from our interventions in nature, that we must tread more lightly on the earth, even those of us who think like that may find ourselves forced against everything we believe in to adopt a completely opposite position because the situation has become so desperate, because so many people are dying, because ecosystems are being destroyed so dramatically. And we may, in fact, find ourselves saying, we hate the idea of solar geoengineering, but we hate the alternative even more. And so if that were to be the case, and we did embark, the world community, if there is such a thing, the planet itself, rather than merely parts of it, would become the object of our technology, of our attempts to regulate the Earth. I think if that happens, it would be an enormous leap for humankind, one that we've hardly begun to think about. In fact, and I'll finish on this point, I think if we do find ourselves in that situation of attempting to take control of and regulate the planet as a whole, I think we don't even have the concepts for understanding what that would mean.